A rural piece of land tucked somewhere in south-central India. It's empty and uneventful and celebrates the lifeline of the country, the railways. In the height of summer, you can feel the heat as you watch a mighty WDP-4 stain the landscape with its exhaust. That is the story of this HO-scale micro layout. It's specially built for show and travel for my friend Jerry to showcase his 3D printed Indian Railways models. An unmanned level crossing, a lonely banyan tree, an aged buffer stop of an old siding, and a little HON30 narrow gauge line, all blended together in simple but hyper-realistic detail. And all that in just 22 inches by 15 inches of area, making it an awesome portable setup that you can carry in a suitcase. Let me show you how it became a reality. I built the base using 8mm thick PVC foam board, which is a good substitute for plywood because it's not affected by heat and humidity, a big concern here in India. But you can definitely use plywood or even MDF if that's what you're comfortable with. Before assembly, I sanded and filed the cut surfaces to ensure they're all square. Contact edges were roughened up so that the glue gets a better hold, an important detail to keep in mind when you work with PVC foam board. I set a timer of 2 minutes when I mixed the epoxy for gluing the top. There was a lot of thin surfaces to cover with a small coffee stirrer, and I did not want my 5-minute epoxy to start hardening before I glued the top. A good collection of my heaviest books helped in weighing it down. This is the wiring diagram used for the electrical connections, and the control panel design was dictated by it. The main component is a 12-volt PWM motor controller with its own direction control switch that I bought from Amazon. In addition, I needed a 5mm indicator LED, a selector switch to choose either the onboard 9-volt DC power or cabled 12-volt power, and a separate polarity switch for the narrow gauge track. This schematic is available in my website, link in the description below. I measured the components on an MDF board that I'd use as the panel. Then it's just a matter of drilling the holes, cutting the slots, and filing them smooth. Now that the panel is ready, it was glued in its designated place and screwed from the underside for firmness. One thing that I invariably forgot was a recess to work as a handle. Here you see me use a router to cut the section off. It was filed to smooth out the jagged edges. Once done, I continued with finishing touches on the baseboard. I cut a few 1.5-inch strips, and this time I simply used a box cutter knife. The strips were roughened, glued, and clamped at the bottom of the edge, and the corners were rounded off. This extra bit is the chair for the acrylic dust cover. We will get to that eventually. The base is now ready. I took some flat black paint and painted the edges. I like to get my edges painted before starting a project to get a good visual frame throughout the building process. The base was not what came first, it was the overhead catenary poles. Indian Railways mostly use H-beam to fix the cantilevers in smaller single-line installations. First, I thought of using the styrene H-beams, but they lacked rigidity, so I decided to make my own using these coffee stirrers. It's time for me to become an alchemist, turning wood into metal. The distance markers on Indian Railways catenary poles are often written by hand or using stencils on a yellow background, and often new painting comes on top of the old ones. For the old faded paint, I took some yellow ochre, which is a much more muted yellow, and semi-dry brushed it on the pole. Then I took standard yellow and painted above it, also denoting that the track height has changed over time. I decided to go for a simpler installation of the OHE for the siding. Only the contact wire without the catenary, just like the prototype. For the termination pole, I attached an insulator at the end of a severed bracket and pushed it through a hole drilled on the pole. Rest of the processes remain the same as you have seen before, and here you have it, 4 poles to be positioned on the diorama. I used Woodland Scenic's foam roadbed, a large model banyan tree, the OHE poles, and a few cars to play around and find the right place for the main elements. I followed prototype practices wherever applicable, for example, terminating the OHE contact wire at an angle. Once satisfied, I pinned the foam roadbeds, cut them at the edge, and outlined their positions. I followed the wiring diagram to solder wires to the necessary components, starting with the DP switches. The diagram that I had shown before outlines all connections. The Code 75 concrete tie tracks from Pico denote Indian Railways broad gauge tracks. I used a combination of spray paints to bring out that rough concrete texture. The narrow gauge track is an old Atlas Code 80 N-scale track modified to represent HUN 30. I used spray paint, brush paint, and dry brushing to make it look realistic. I covered the painting, detailing, and wiring of these tracks in a dedicated episode. Link in the description below. I connected the wires to the correct leads and terminals and used wire management clips to secure them properly. I left a couple of open connections. They will be used later to provide connection to the fiddle tracks. The top of the rails was cleaned. The tree and OHE installations were put back for a quick mock run. Time for a little test. In case you're wondering, there are no commercially available model train of Indian Railways. Jerry, my friend who commissioned this diorama, designed these locomotives and 3D printed them. And I built this diorama so that those beautiful models can come to life. I had to make provision for removable fiddle tracks for both the broad gauge and narrow gauge lines. I thought of trying magnets for alignment since it doesn't need protruding studs. And as you'll see, it's pretty cool. The idea is that the fiddle tracks will have their own set of magnets, and given how strong these earth magnets are, they will easily self-align. We'll see how that works out. Just like the overhead equipment poles, the railway and road signs were built separately. I used real photographs and resized them in the photo editing software. I printed them, cut them, and glued them to T-beams made out of styrene. I covered making of these signs in detail in a separate episode. Link in the description below. To pave the crossing, I took reference from a real level crossing that I found during my trip to the Western Ghats, and decided to use textured pavements by Feisman. The real level crossings have misalignments, uneven gaps, broken tiles, and surface unevenness. I replicated them faithfully. Now, let's take a few steps back and see how that road was built. I had a weathered asphalt road in mind for the scene and wanted to try out some experimental road building methods. Before the road surface, I had to build up the base and the subroad bed. And for that, I decided to go for expanded polystyrene, or as we know them here in India, thermocol. The road surface, however, was made using 3 mm thick PVC foam board. I used more pieces of thermocol to build the terrain base. There is no right or wrong way to do this. I just made sure to keep the variation of the ground natural and create a gentle slope around the level crossing for visual interest. I used strips of 3mm PVC board to align the cross-section of the road and the raised scenery with the edge of the diorama. The diorama is now ready for some scenery. Scenery is super fun and easy. I used materials that are available here in India, sculpting clay that I wet heavily to create a thick paste, and added 30% of gypsum powder to work as a binding agent. Notice the high water content in the clay. The reason for adding more water is to make sure that the clay flows into all nooks and crannies, mixes well with the white glue below, and dries slow. Even application and slow drying is important to avoid major cracks and dislocations. I added a very thin layer on the banyan tree side. I'm still far away from planting the tree here, so that area will have to be developed later. The diorama was left in the sun for the clay to dry, under expert supervision of my henchmen. Hench dogs. The clay dried a horrible pink color, but that wouldn't matter much since I'd paint a base coat anyway. Before I add a base layer of scenery, it was important to mask the tracks, the road and the level crossing, the control panel, and the painted edges. I took the best bit of soil from a flowering pot under the strict guidance of the digging supervisor. The soil was bone dry at the height of summer, but if you deal with wet soil, you need to dry it in an oven before use. Dry soil flows better through sieve, an important criterion for this method. To apply the scenic base, I'd use Mod Podge matte, 50% diluted isopropyl alcohol, and scenic glue. which is nothing but 25% diluted Mod Podge matte with a few drops of dishwashing soap. When wetting the base, it's important to have a good misting bottle that sprays fine particles. The idea here is to soak all the dirt without disturbing them. The IPA water mix serves three purposes: binds the dirt with the glue underneath by diluting the glue, activates the grout to act as a binding agent, and finally creates a wet base for the Scenic glue that's coming next. Remember to remove the masking before the glue takes hold, else it will take chunks of scenery with it. It's time for ballasting. For the narrow gauge line, I had a buried in dirt look in mind. So I took some superfine dirt and grout mix, added a bit of medium grade dirt and some fine N-scale brown ballast. I buried the ties and spread the ballast evenly. Then I soaked the ballast with the water IPA mix and applied the Scenic glue thoroughly. For the broad gauge siding and the main line, I followed a two-step process. First, I applied the ballast on the slanting slope of the roadbed, directly on undiluted Mod Podge. Second, I made a ballast applicator tool with a plastic pipette and a discarded funnel, and applied the ballast between the ties evenly. Idea here was to apply the ballast so that the top half of the tie remains visible, as it often happens in the real life. I thoroughly soaked the ballast in IPA before flooding it with Scenic glue. Then came weathering and detailing, including adding a lighter color shoulder at the intersection of the ground and ballast. I used mixture of soft pastels and beige grout to get these effects. And before you ask, no, the pastel and grout don't need additional fixative. They stick pretty well on rough surfaces that you don't touch regularly, and future layers of Scenic glue will anyway soak through and reach them. To simulate oil stains, I applied some black paint down the middle and then used Tester's oil and grease stain to accentuate. I've covered the ballasting process in a separate video where I discussed my methods and techniques in detail. Link in the description below. I had a moderately weathered and broken country road in mind and decided to build that effect in layers. For the top layer of asphalt, I mixed a darker tone of grey and applied using a sponge roller brush. The sponge texture and the various tones underneath create a three-dimensional weathered effect of an old, ill-maintained road. The level crossing was masked to protect the painted tiles. The oil deposit on the level crossing causes some prominent tire tracks on the lighter colored tiles. To simulate this, I took some grey and black soft pastel, applied it on the wheels of an HO scale car, and simply dragged it across the level crossing a few times. I say the road turned out pretty convincing even in close-up. Now the real fun begins. Here is where Pico Precision Static Grass Applicator enters the scene. I start with short 1 and 2 mm static grass at the shoulder of the road. The narrow gauge track needed some growth around and between the rails. Here I used 1 mm grass and not taller so that they don't get sucked into those tiny mechanisms that would run on these tracks. To simulate dry patches of grass, I took some 4 mm winter grass and 6 mm straw. I collected all the loose static grass and called for my big sucker friend to eat the remaining bits. He hardly eats any green. And what a transformation! Let's take a moment to enjoy this. The banyan tree is a heavy model and due to its complex roots cannot just be glued or pinned like other model trees. First, I put a wire around a secured wire loop in the root. The idea is to drill 2 holes past the binding wire below the baseboard and secure it from underneath. I drilled the holes and marked it using a couple of toothpicks. To fill up the land, I decided to use a different sculpting clay that had a natural color compared to the previous one. Idea was that when it dries, I wouldn't have to paint it. It's time to plant the big tree. As the clay dried, I saw a big problem. This clay had much higher shrink ratio than the previous one, resulting in a huge crack around the perimeter. To fix the issue, I put some white glue in the cracks and then covered it with the old clay gypsum powder mix. It worked out in the end, but now I needed to paint this. As the Scenic glue was still wet, I took the opportunity to apply the static grass right away. It was a small area and could be done quickly. Later, I twisted those two wires underneath for extra protection. Oh, look at that! Now that surely looks beautiful. I decided to build the buffer stops and the barricade using rails, just like the prototype. For the barricade along the track, I'm going for a rail barricade design. So I used super glue to attach the 15mm long code 75 rails to 60mm long code 55 ones. Electric lines on the Indian Railways have a protection bar on both sides of a level crossing to protect the OHE from tall vehicles. I turned to my collection of stock styrene supply to build this from scratch. I decided to go for concrete barricade along the road, grabbed some scrap pieces of PVC foam board, removed the shiny and smooth outer layer to expose the softer and rough material underneath. For the protection bars and barricades, I had to create that signature black and white zebra pattern, which means a lot of masking. So let's get on with it. It took me 3 days to finish masking all of them. This was the most irritating part of the whole project, but as you'll see, it was worth it. You often find loose concrete ties along the railway lines. Remember the Code 75 tracks I used earlier? These are the ties that came with it. It's time to repurpose them as individual details. While gluing the loose ties on the ballast slope, I made sure to add some extra ballast around the edges to sink them in. This gives them weight and creates an illusion that they're heavy objects. Remember those scrap rails that I painted deep brown? Time to glue them beside the track to simulate rusty rails. Shrubs, anyone? If you want to know how to make these little plants, shrubs and bushes, find my video about making highly detailed model trees. Link in the description below. The medium-sized tree was planted diagonally opposite the banyan tree, on the other side of the road as well as the railway track to balance the scene. It's definitely quite a transformation. I did one final round of cleanup and also cleaned the top of the rails using a wooden chopstick. It's time to do one round of testing of all the tracks to make sure there are no dead spots. The GE 45-ton definitely looks like an intruder in the middle of those Indian Railways WDP4 and NDM6. As I was mentioning before, these fantastic locomotives are 3D printed, believe it or not. My friend Jerry commissioned this diorama just so that he can showcase his 3D printed Indian Railways items. If you're interested about Indian Railways locomotives and rolling stocks, find his Shapeways shop for loads of IR stuff from broad gauge to 2 feet narrow gauge. Link in the description below. I used Weissman 360mm catenary wire code 4143 for this project. One of those had to be cut to form the single contact wire for the siding. Real catenary wire is not really aluminium color, and because I'll not be passing any actual current to any locomotive through these wires, I decided to paint them black. Notice the use of the height gauge. I made this using scrap styrene and PVC foam board pieces, and it turned out to be an important tool throughout the project. The styrene wall is exactly at the center of the track, and I used this to get the zigzag orientation of the catenary wires just like the prototype, keeping the nodes 2mm off-center in alternate direction. The OHE termination on the siding required stays, and I decided to use Easy Line for this. Plus, I had some unique detailing in mind, a vine to climb up the wires. I did final touch-ups wherever required. Then I drilled little holes and placed the road and railway signs. These little signs definitely set the scene. I painted the remaining white parts on the fascia black and gave the whole edge a second coat of black paint. The black framing definitely makes a big difference. My original plan was to get 3mm thick acrylic sheets and make a solid dust cover that would also protect the diorama from damage. But the lockdown forced me to use this flimsy 1mm acrylic sheets and clear packaging tape to build a makeshift cover. The diorama is not going anywhere soon, so for now, just a dust cover will do. The trains need somewhere off the diorama to continue the journey, so I needed a couple of fiddle tracks. I already installed the strong earth magnets in the diorama as you have seen before. All that remains now is to make a fiddle track that will self-align with those magnets. Installing the fiddle tracks needs patience and care. First, I made sure that the board is properly aligned with the main diorama and there is no tension or obstruction. Then, I carefully aligned the two rails, making sure the ends match up perfectly, both horizontally and vertically. As you join the connectors and align the tracks, electrically the track extensions act as one and trains can move from the Fiddle to Diorama and vice versa without any issue. As the locos run on the tracks, they come to an automatic stop as they hit that separate track that is connected through the push button, since that section is an open circuit till that button is pressed. For a micro layout like this, that is designed to go on shows, it's important to build safety so that those precious locos don't end up like the one in Back to the Future. I explained this in the wiring diagram, but basically I've cut a gap in the rail. That gap is bridged only when you press a push button switch. It's simple but an effective safety measure for a micro layout. The operator then readjusts the direction, and when ready, presses the push button for the train to start moving again. I printed JBM and Trends and Dioramas logos, including the QR codes of my channel and his shop. This will be used to make an attractive branding panel. Created a PVC frame for it with clear acrylic lamination and glued it on the panel. It's quite fun to have those handy QR codes, perfect for a show diorama. The control panel needed its labels. I printed them on label paper on black background, cut them and pasted them on the panel in their designated places. BG denotes broad gauge and NG denotes narrow gauge. I needed a stop sign for the siding for electric locomotives. I used the same method I used for the other signs to take a scaled printout and then weathered it. A milepost was thrown in the mix as well. The locomotives that Jerry had sent me to complement the diorama were also weathered, and I'm having a blast playing with them on the layout in this lockdown. Out of all the details, those hyper-realistic tracks and the little signboards are a definite winner for me, as they really tie things together and give the layout identity. The trees and the shrubs make a big difference too. Thank you for watching and hope you enjoyed the show.